The grand halls of the Galactic Combat Institute stretched impossibly high into the purple skies of Centauri Prime, its crystalline spires reflecting the light of 3 suns in dazzling patterns. For 10,000 years, these halls had housed the most prestigious combat training facility in the known universe, or at least, that's what the Centaurians claimed, and no one had ever challenged them on it. First Master Vexthor stood at his customary position in the observatory dome, his 4 arms clasped behind his back in the traditional pose of contemplation. His iridescent scales shimmered as he watched the annual arrival of new students through the quantum glass windows. Most were the usual sort, wealthy offspring of various galactic species, sent to learn the prestigious art of stellar combat over the next century or two. But this cycle was different. This cycle, they had a human. First Master, came the nervous voice of his assistant, Crittle. The human candidate has arrived early. Vexthor's secondary breathing chambers constricted slightly, the Centaurian equivalent of a sigh. Early, the ceremonial arrival sequence isn't scheduled to begin for another 3 rotations. She's already in the grand antechamber, sir. She's doing something called stretching. Maya Torres stood in the center of the vast antechamber, completely ignoring the scandalized looks from the other early arrivals as she went through her warm-up routine. Her compact human frame moved with fluid precision, each motion speaking to years of practical combat experience. The standard-issue Institute robes lay neatly folded beside her, replaced by simple Earth athletic wear. "This is unprecedented," Crittle whispered, his head frills vibrating with anxiety. "No one has ever skipped the 3 days of preparatory meditation." "She is a Deathworlder," Vexthor reminded him. "We knew accepting her application would bring complications." Down in the antechamber, Maya finished her warm-up and began examining the ancient combat murals that lined the walls. Her eyes, trained through years of Special Forces operations, noticed something immediately. For all their beautiful artistic merit, none of the depicted poses would work in actual combat. "Interesting," she murmured, making notes on her datapad. Another violation of traditional protocol. The first true test came during the opening ceremony. While the other new students floated in perfect meditation poses, Maya stood at parade rest, her military bearing a stark contrast to the ethereal positioning of her classmates. "Candidates," First Master Vexthor's voice resonated through the chamber. "You stand in the halls of perfection, where for 10 millennia we have preserved and refined the purest forms of combat knowledge." Maya's hand shot up. The assembled masters nearly lost their ceremonial floating poses in shock. Questions were not permitted until after the traditional week of silent observation. "Yes, human Taurus," Vexthor managed, his scales shifting to a slightly paler shade of purple. "Sir, I've reviewed the historical archives. Has anyone ever actually used these techniques in combat?" The silence that followed was profound enough to qualify as a meditation session. Vexthor's 4 arms moved through a series of calming positions before he responded. "The art of stellar combat transcends mere physical confrontation. Through perfect form and spiritual harmony, we achieve victory without conflict." Maya nodded thoughtfully. "So that's a no then." In the observer's gallery, Crittle nearly fainted. "First Master, perhaps we should reconsider." "No," Vexthor interrupted, surprising himself with his firmness. "The human stays. The Council of Masters was clear. We must adapt to the changing galaxy." He paused, watching as Maya began asking detailed questions about the practical applications of various forms. "Though perhaps the galaxy is about to adapt to us instead." The first training session proved even more revolutionary than the opening ceremony. While other students practiced the beginning pose of enlightenment, a series of minute movements typically taking 5 years to master, Maya was already combining elements from advanced forms she'd merely glimpsed in the archive displays. Human Taurus, called Master Yilara, her crystalline form vibrating with concern. "These movements are not meant to be learned for at least 3 centuries." "Why not?" Maya demonstrated a fluid combination of three supposedly incompatible forms. They flow naturally into each other. Look, this defensive position perfectly counters the attack form from the third scroll of mastery. Attack form. Ylara's crystals chimed in distress. These are poses of philosophical contemplation, but several of the younger students had stopped their prescribed practices to watch. Maya's movements held something their traditional training lacked: purpose. Every shift in position, every turn and step seemed to have a reason behind it. As the first day drew to a close, Vexthor found himself facing an unprecedented situation. The human had already mastered movements that took most students decades to learn, but more importantly, she was asking questions that had never been asked in 10,000 years of tradition. In his private meditation chamber, Vexthor reviewed the security footage of Maya's training session. Her adaptations of the ancient forms were unorthodox, certainly, but he couldn't deny their effectiveness. Perhaps, he mused, breaking his evening meditation schedule for the first time in 3 centuries, it was time for the Institute to learn something new. Little did he know, Maya Torres wasn't just there to learn. She had been sent with a very specific purpose, one that would shake the foundations of the Galactic Combat Institute's 10,000 years of tradition. The real question was, were they ready for what she was about to show them? By the end of her first week at the Galactic Combat Institute, Maya Torres had broken exactly 2,347 traditions. Crittle had been keeping count. But what truly disturbed the Institute's masters wasn't the breaking of tradition. It was how she was making their ancient art look increasingly obsolete. Observe, Maya demonstrated to a small group of fascinated students in the secondary practice hall. The pose of Eternal Mountain isn't just about standing still for a decade. If you shift your weight like this, she adjusted her stance slightly. It becomes a perfect foundation for counterattacks. Master Ylara watched from the observation platform, her crystalline form vibrating with increasing frequency. First Master, she's teaching. Students are not permitted to teach for at least 5 centuries. Vexthor stood beside her, all 4 arms clasped tightly behind his back. And yet, she appears to be rather good at it. Below, Maya was working with a young Arcturian named Zix, whose gelatinous form was traditionally considered unsuitable for advanced combat forms. Your species' natural flexibility is actually an advantage, she explained, guiding him through a modified version of an advanced sequence. See how you can flow from one position to another without the rigid transitions. For the first time in his 3 decades of training, Zix executed a perfect defensive sequence. His bioluminescent patterns glowed with excitement, another violation of emotional control protocols. This must stop, declared Master Colvin, entering the observation platform. His ancient exoskeleton creaked with ceremonial authority. She is corrupting 10,000 years of perfect form with practicality. Vexthor suggested mildly. In truth, the first master had been watching Maya's modifications with growing interest. Her innovations weren't random. They were systematic improvements based on real combat principles. More disturbing still, they worked. During the evening meditation session, which Maya had transformed into what she called practical application time, she demonstrated something that made several masters question their centuries of training. The traditional forms aren't just beautiful, she explained, moving through a series of flowing combinations. They're actually fragments of an incredibly effective combat system. Someone, somewhere along the line, turned practical techniques into artistic poses. Preposterous, huffed Master Colvin. The forms have always been purely ceremonial. Maya responded by demonstrating how the pose of celestial harmony, when executed at combat speed, was actually a devastating joint lock. She followed it with proof that the 3-century meditation sequence was, in fact, a series of pressure point strikes. Word of her innovation spread through the Institute like a quantum wave collapse. Soon, students were secretly practicing her modified forms in their private chambers. Even some of the younger masters began questioning the traditional teaching methods. But it was during the monthly demonstration of mastery that everything changed. Maya stood before the assembly of masters, her simple earth combat suit a stark contrast to the ornate ceremonial robes of her peers. "For my demonstration," she announced, breaking protocol by speaking before the traditional 3 hours of preparatory silence, "I will show the practical application of the first scroll of ancient knowledge." The masters muttered in disapproval. The first scroll was considered so sacred that it was traditionally only viewed once every century, and never performed. What followed was nothing short of revolutionary. Maya moved through the sequences inscribed on the sacred scroll, but at full speed and with martial intent. Suddenly, the seemingly random collection of poses transformed into a devastating combat form. These weren't meant to be separate poses, she explained, continuing her demonstration. They're training sequences for real combat scenarios. Look at the progression. Each movement flows into the next, creating a complete system of self-defense. In the highest tier of the observation dome, a shadowy figure watched with particular interest. Grandmaster Hextalar, head of the Institute's secret council, had not shown himself publicly in 3 centuries. His ancient eyes narrowed as he watched the human demonstrate her discoveries. "She's getting too close to the truth," he whispered to his aide. "Contact the council. The human must be dealt with." Meanwhile, Maya was building a following. Students began approaching her in secret, asking for private instruction. Even Criddle, despite his devotion to tradition, found himself practicing her modified forms when he thought no one was watching. But it was what Maya discovered in the restricted archives that truly threatened the Institute's foundations. Hidden behind centuries of ceremonial documentation, she found evidence that the original combat system had been deliberately obscured, transformed into ceremonial poses to prevent its actual use. The question was, why? And more importantly, what would the Institute's masters do to keep this secret buried? As Maya lay in her quarters that night, reviewing her findings on her datapad, she received an encrypted message from Earth Command. Evidence found. Proceed with Phase 2. Be careful, they know. She smiled grimly. The real challenge was about to begin, and the Institute's carefully maintained facade of tradition was about to face its greatest test in 10,000 years. First Master Vexthor, watching through the quantum surveillance system, made a decision that would change the course of galactic martial arts forever. The question was, would he side with 10 millennia of tradition, or with the truth that Maya Torres was uncovering? The ancient security systems of the Galactic Combat Institute had never been designed to track someone with Maya Torres training. As she slipped through the quantum shadows of the restricted archives at midnight, her movements were a perfect blend of the Institute's traditional forms and Earth Special Forces techniques. 3 levels below the meditation chambers, she found what she was looking for. The true records, stored on crystal matrices that predated the Institute itself. But she wasn't alone. "I wondered how long it would take you to find this place." First Master Vexthor's voice emerged from the darkness. All 4 of his arms were relaxed, a clear sign to Maya that he was ready for combat. "You've known all along, haven't you?" Maya remained in a neutral stance, one that could shift instantly into any of 12 different defensive positions. About the real purpose of the Institute. Vexthor's scales shifted through several shades of purple before settling on a deep indigo. "What I know is that you are not a simple student seeking enlightenment through our ancient arts. Just as this isn't simply a school." Maya gestured to the crystals surrounding them. These contained the original combat techniques, before they were deliberately corrupted into ceremonial poses. The question is, why? Instead of attacking, as Maya had half expected, Vexthor did something unprecedented. He laughed. The sound echoed strangely in the archive chamber, probably the first time laughter had been heard there in millennia. "You humans," he said, his scales rippling with amusement. "Always so direct. Did you think you were the first to discover this truth?" He approached one of the crystal matrices and activated it with a complex gesture. Holographic images sprang to life around them, showing warriors from 1,000 different species performing combat moves that were eerily similar to Maya's innovations. 3,000 years ago, Vexthor explained, the galaxy was torn apart by endless warfare. Every species had developed their own lethal combat techniques. The death toll was astronomical. Maya watched as the holograms showed scenes of devastating martial arts being used in actual combat. So the Institute was created to prevent this, by turning real combat techniques into harmless ceremonial poses. Created? No. Vexthor's expression darkened. The Institute was corrupted. What you see around you was once the greatest repository of martial knowledge in the galaxy. Then the Peace Council took control. Understanding dawned on Maya's face. The 1,000-year gap in the Institute's records. That's when it happened. The Council decided that the only way to ensure galactic peace was to suppress all real combat knowledge. They infiltrated every major martial arts school in the galaxy. Most were simply destroyed. But the Institute, he gestured at the grandiose architecture above them. The Institute they transformed into something far more insidious. A place that teaches combat in a way that makes it completely useless. Maya finished, keeping the forms but stripping them of any practical application, and taking so long to learn that no one could master enough to be dangerous. Precisely. Vexthor moved to another crystal matrix, but they didn't manage to destroy everything. Some of us have preserved the true knowledge, waiting for the right moment, the right catalyst. You've been watching me since I arrived. Maya realized, not to stop me, but to see if I could rediscover the original techniques on my own. And you've exceeded all expectations, but now comes the true danger. Vexthor's scales darkened further. The Council still exists, hidden in shadows. They've already noticed your innovations. Even now, they're moving to eliminate what they see as a threat to galactic peace. As if on cue, Maya's encrypted communicator vibrated. The message from Earth Command was brief. Council assassins dispatched. Maintain cover. Backup incoming. They're not just coming for me, are they? Maya asked, though she already knew the answer. No. Anyone who has learned your modified forms, your real combat techniques, will be considered a threat. Vexthor's secondary breathing chambers expanded grimly, including half the student body and several young masters. Maya's mind raced through the implications. How long do we have? The Council moves slowly, as all things do here, but not slowly enough. Their agents will arrive within days. And then, he left the sentence unfinished. Then we'll be ready, Maya said firmly, because I'm not the only one who came prepared for this fight. Vexthor's scales shifted to a curious shade of blue. What do you mean? Maya smiled. Did you really think Earth sent just one operative to the most prestigious combat school in the galaxy? Every human service worker, maintenance tech, and cook in this facility is a trained Special Forces operator. We've been preparing for this possibility for months. Fascinating, Vexthor mused. It seems humanity has learned to play the long game as well as we do. He paused, considering. The question now is, what do we do with the time we have left? Maya's expression hardened with determination. We teach them everything. All of it. As much as we can, as fast as we can. No more centuries-long training programs. No more hidden knowledge. It's time everyone learned what these forms really mean. The Council will see it as an act of war, Vexthor warned. No, Maya corrected him. They'll see it as a revolution. And this time, we're fighting for the right to learn how to fight. Above them, the Institute's ancient halls seemed to hold their breath, waiting for the storm that was about to break. In meditation chambers and practice halls, students and young masters continued their secret practice of Maya's techniques, unaware that they were about to become soldiers in a war that had been silent for 3,000 years. The time for meditation was over. The time for action had begun. The next 3 days at the Galactic Combat Institute saw more change than the previous 1,000 years combined. The grand halls, once filled with students moving in painfully slow meditation, now buzzed with focused energy as Maya and her fellow Earth operatives taught the true combat forms at near-combat speed. Remember, Maya instructed a group of students in what had once been the Hall of Eternal Stillness. These techniques were never meant to be performed in isolation. They flow together, like water, adapting to any situation. Her students, a mix of various species from across the galaxy, moved through the forms with growing confidence. The young Arcturian, Zix, had become one of her star pupils, his gelatinous form executing perfect combinations that would have been impossible under the old teaching methods. In his private chambers, First Master Vexthor was coordinating with other secret traditionalists, masters who had preserved the true knowledge through millennia of enforced stagnation. The human was right, he reported via quantum-encrypted channels. The Council's agents are already here, disguised as new administrative staff. How many? The voice belonged to Master Yilara, who had revealed herself as another preserver of the ancient truth. At least 30 confirmed operatives, Maya answered, stepping out of the quantum shadows. Both masters managed to hide their surprise. Almost. But we've been tracking Council movements for months. There are probably twice that many we haven't identified yet. Months. Yilara's crystalline form shimmered with curiosity. How long has Earth known about the Council's true nature? Maya's expression was grim. Ever since they tried to infiltrate our martial arts schools on Earth 20 years ago. The Council's agents found that humans learn too quickly. We're naturally resistant to their strategy of making combat training take centuries. So they marked humanity as a potential threat, Vexthor realized. Exactly. That's when we started our counter-operation. Every human who's worked at the Institute in the past 5 years has been gathering intelligence. Maya activated a holographic display showing the Institute's complete layout, with dozens of points marked in red. We've identified most of their secret surveillance systems, their quantum tunnels for agent deployment, everything. And now? Yilara asked. Now we spring our trap. Maya's smile held no humor. The Council thinks they're coming to eliminate a small group of troublemakers. They don't realize they're walking into a facility full of combat-ready students who know their real techniques. The next morning, during what was supposed to be the traditional ceremony of dawn contemplation, the Council made its move. Quantum doors appeared simultaneously in multiple locations throughout the Institute, disgorging teams of black-clad operatives. They moved with lethal grace, their movements revealing the truth. The Council had kept the real combat techniques for its own forces, but the Institute was ready. In the Grand Hall, a team of Council operators burst in expecting to find helpless students in meditation. Instead, they found 30 young warriors of various species, led by Zix, executing perfect combat forms at full speed. The battle that followed would be remembered for centuries. Throughout the Institute, similar scenes played out. Council agents found themselves facing not just human operators, but students and young masters who had spent every waking moment of the past 3 days learning real combat techniques. The Council's greatest weapon, the suppression of martial knowledge, had been turned against them. In the central spire, Maya faced off against the Council's lead operative, a figure whose species she couldn't identify beneath their advanced stealth suit. "You have no idea what you've done." The operative's voice was artificially modulated. The galaxy was at peace. "Peace through enforced helplessness isn't peace," Maya responded, settling into a stance that blended 3 different combat traditions. "It's just oppression with better marketing." The fight that followed was like nothing the Institute had seen in 3 millennia. Both warriors moved with impossible speed, their forms perfect, each strike flowing into the next. But Maya had one advantage. She'd been training others, forcing her to break down and understand every movement in ways her opponent never had. In the end, it came down to innovation versus tradition. When the Council operative attempted a killing strike from the 3rd scroll of ancient knowledge, Maya countered with her own modification, a blend of the original technique and modern Earth close combat tactics. The operative went down, their stealth suit flickering into transparency to reveal a human. Maya's surprise lasted only a moment. Of course, the Council would use humans. They learned quickly enough to master the real techniques. We tried to keep the galaxy safe, the operative gasped, to prevent another war. By making sure only your people could fight effectively. Maya shook her head. That's not peace. That's just preparing for a war you know you'll win. Throughout the Institute, the Council's forces were being subdued. Centuries of hidden knowledge were being freed. And in the highest observation dome, First Master Vex Thor watched it all unfold with both hope and concern. Because this wasn't just a battle for the Institute, it was the beginning of a galactic revolution. The question now was, what would the galaxy do with its reclaimed martial knowledge? The answer would come sooner than anyone expected. The aftermath of what would become known as the Battle of the Institute unfolded across several dramatic days. The ancient halls, which had witnessed nothing more violent than meditation for 3 millennia, now bore the marks of real combat. But it was what happened next that truly changed the galaxy. Maya stood before the assembled students, masters, and most importantly, the quantum-linked representatives of 100 worlds. The grand demonstration hall had never been so full, nor so tense with anticipation. For 3,000 years, she began, her voice carrying to every corner of the vast chamber. We were told that peace could only be maintained by making combat training so slow, so ceremonial, that it became useless. Today, we prove otherwise. Behind her stood a mixed group of students, survivors of the Council's attack. Zix the Arcturian, his gelatinous form bearing proud bioluminescent patterns. A young Centaurian master whose scales still showed battle marks. Even Crittle, who had finally chosen truth over tradition. Begin, Maya commanded. What followed was unlike anything the galaxy had seen in millennia. The students moved through combat forms at full speed, their movements precise and powerful. But it wasn't just a display of martial skill, it was a demonstration of harmony. Each species brought its unique abilities to the forms, adapting and improving them. This is what the Council feared. First Master Vex Thor addressed the watching representatives. Not that we would learn to fight, but that we would learn to fight together. To understand each other through martial arts, rather than despite them. The demonstration continued, showing how different species could complement each other's strengths. Zix's fluid form flowed around a Centaurian's powerful strikes, while Crittle's traditional techniques had been modified to work in perfect synchronization with Earth combat methods. The Council's secret was never about preventing violence, Maya explained as her students demonstrated. It was about preventing understanding. Real martial arts isn't about hurting others. It's about understanding movement, respect, and the true meaning of peace. In the quantum feeds, representatives from worlds across the galaxy watched in stunned silence. Many had sent their children to the Institute over the centuries, never knowing they were participating in a grand deception. We offer you a choice, Maya continued. Continue with the old way. Ceremonial poses that take centuries to learn and teach nothing of value. Or join us in building something new. A true galactic combat institute, where every species can learn from each other, where we find strength in our differences rather than fear them. The silence that followed was profound. Then, from the quantum feed of Earth's representatives, came the first response. Earth stands with the new institute. One by one, other worlds joined in. Even those who had traditionally supported the Council couldn't deny the power of what they'd witnessed. But it was what happened next that truly demonstrated the change. A group of captured Council agents, their stealth suits disabled, were brought before the Assembly. Justice would be easy, Maya announced. But wisdom is harder. These agents, like many of us, were deceived. They believed they were maintaining peace, so we offer them the same choice we offer everyone. Stay and learn the true ways, or leave in peace. To everyone's surprise, most of the agents chose to stay. As one of them explained, we joined the Council because we wanted to protect the galaxy. Maybe it's time we learned how to do that honestly. In the months that followed, the Institute underwent a transformation. The ancient halls still stood, But now they rang with the sounds of real training, real learning, real growth. Students who once spent decades learning single poses now mastered effective techniques in months. But more importantly, they learned from each other. Earth combat instructors taught alongside Centaurian masters. Arcturian fluid form experts shared techniques with crystalline beings. Each species brought its own perspective, its own strengths, creating something greater than the sum of its parts. Maya watched it all from the observation dome, standing beside First Master Vexthor. "You know," she said, "I expected more resistance to change." "The galaxy was ready," he replied, his scales shifting through thoughtful colors. 3,000 years of enforced meditation gave everyone plenty of time to think about what was wrong with the old system. And the Council? Their power came from keeping others weak. Once that was exposed, their influence crumbled quickly. He turned to her. "The question is, what now?" Maya smiled, watching as below them, a new group of students, including representatives from species that had been traditional enemies, moved through combat forms together. "Now we do what martial arts was always meant to do," she said. "We build strength not to dominate, but to protect. We learn combat not to fight, but to understand each other better. And maybe, just maybe, we create a peace that's based on mutual respect rather than enforced ignorance." The three sons of Centauri Prime sat behind the Institute's spires, their light catching the repair work being done to the battle-damaged halls. But unlike before, these marks weren't being erased. They would remain as reminders that true peace isn't found in avoiding conflict, but in learning to face it with wisdom and courage. And in the growing dusk, the sounds of real training, real learning, and real growth echoed through the halls of the new Galactic Combat Institute, a promise of a future where understanding comes through action, and peace through strength shared rather than suppressed. The revolution was over. The evolution had begun.